So how are you today?
Good, very good. I'm very glad to talk to you. I have a bunch of questions to ask you.
Fair enough. Well, let's start. You tell everyone listening who you are.
My name is Samuel Chong. I'm a certified court interpreter and a Chinese translator in Los Angeles. And I translated the book 334,000 Lies, written by supposedly the highest degree chair, the former highest degree chair of the Illuminati. Even though the book doesn't mention the word Illuminati, it just uses the word the lodge. And I checked it out from my own resources or on the internet that is probably talking about the Illuminati. And I did the translation from German into English.
Interesting. And since then, what have you been doing? You said you're a court interpreter, right?
Yes, I still work with a lot of attorneys and doctors and also business people and companies and providing translation interpretation services in Los Angeles and elsewhere.
Well, that must be a blast.
Yes. It's a totally two different worlds.
Absolutely. So
Mhm.
I am kind of familiar with the book. A lot of what you know, I use the word Illuminati, even though I know that's not what they really call themselves. It's just, the internet lingo for that. But a lot of what they put out, it's, very deliberate, right? Like even if a leak, like when I wrote my blog, they watched that, right? And I was getting warnings constantly of like, oh, watch what you say there, watch that topic, like that kind of thing. So when I see the bigger releases, I know how they work in that they want to be able to tell you what they're doing, right?
Mhm.
Like it's that very, abusive thing that they do where they want to kind of in a way let you know that hey, we're controlling you, we're messing with you, we're, doing these things, but it's also just off enough that we can't catch them, right?
Mhm.
So, but yeah. So from there, how did that change your life?
Well, I found the book when I was searching for ways to read and see auras. And there's a post on the internet saying that, oh, this book talks about it, but it's only in German. So I thought, why don't I translate it into English so that it has more wider audience? So I did a translation. It turned out that the copyright holder is a German consulting company, and I got the permission and learned a lot of interesting things written in the book, including the rituals, how they're able to predict the future using a special form of astrology, and how they influence people's mind and also the psychic powers and what we would call the magic, including being able to kill a person just using the mind, and how they influence the behaviors of politicians and how the organization works on both continents, Europe and the US, North America. It talks about their headquarters being in New York, in North America.
Yeah, it's a little bit further north than that, but it's close enough. When they first developed the United States, that was, where they started, right? Like,
Mm,
and then they spread out and eventually came south. But yeah, Canada is very highly unwritten about because
mm.
it's a good way to just don't look into us. We're just this stupid little country on top of America. Don't worry about us. But a lot of their
That is,
actual headquarters have
mhm.
been up here, and yeah, it's interesting whenever if I were to walk around the city of Toronto with a friend or even the town that I live in now, being able to actually point to these things that have been here long before Canada was ever a country. And that's why, right? And there's always, a Freemason lodge or a Rosicrucian lodge or something like that close by to, the center of all of these places. And yeah, but you mentioned like the two continents. Did you grow up in China?
Yes, I grew up in China, in Beijing, China, and I came here at the age of 15, so back in 1993.
Has your
Most
research ever led you back to home?
I travel back there once in a while. Unless I have to, I prefer to remain outside of China because I learned about the Chinese members from whistleblower. I learned about the members of Illuminati in China. It's pretty interesting, especially relating to what happened in the last 3 years or so.
Yeah, it's again, you know, I've been kind of pointing to a lot of our writings, like a lot of the books available and stuff like that. They all point to the U.S., right? It's the U.S. and it's England, and that's been kind of a on purpose, like a decoy or a diversion technique. You know, countries like Canada or China or even Russia, and you know, the ones that we don't get proper reporting on in North America, as I'm sure you are well aware of, right? The ones that we don't hear much about, that's where they really hide their things because just makes sense. No one's paying any attention, right? But uh, the United States is their creation, so that's why it's so important, right?
Yeah, I want to ask you about the you were talking in an interview that you were acting as a disinformation agent for the organization. And how did that work? What kind of information did you gather, like the paranormal, from the paranormal community that you wrote and then was thrown out? And what kind of information did they really want to put out in the world? Like, what are the differences between the two?
Well, it wasn't even that they had something else that they wanted to put out. It was really just that they had the one thing that they wanted to hide, which is anything to do with magic, right? So anything to do with paranormal activity, ghosts, poltergeists, any type of possessions, um, anything that had to do with the spirit world, basically. They wanted to gather as all the evidence that they could, get all of the interviews, make all of these people feel safe, make them feel like they got it off their chest and got their story out there and all of that. And instead of releasing that to the public, it just got buried, right?
Mm.
So that we could have this technological revolution, this push towards transhumanism, because what has happened over, you know, thousands of years is the magic hold that they had on the world, which you spoke to earlier, all the different tactics that they've used to do that with astrology and various forms of mind control, they're not nearly as good at anymore, right? It's like you know, generationally they've become a little bit more or less lazy, a little bit more uh off balance, not as powerful, let's put it, over time. And so to compensate for that, they've used, you know, people like myself and others that have exhibited those abilities to study us and to test us and to figure out exactly how it all works. Take
Mhm.
that information again, bury it so that no one thinks, hey, this is just human power. This is like human ability, right? And here's technology that directly mimics it.
Mm.
Right? Like a very obvious one would be computer simulation models. Our brain is capable of doing that. You can actually train your brain to do exactly that faster than a computer could, believe it or not. But we use computers because we have, you know, over time slowed the brain down on people so that their brain doesn't work that way. So that's that mimic of magic and technology. And so when I say that I was working as a disinformation agent, that's how, right? Because I would be telling people, you know, what we're doing, like, please tell me your story, please give me your artifacts, your pictures, all of that physical evidence, because what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to make this re-education package that's going to go to schools, and everyone on planet Earth is going to get to learn through your experience, which I didn't really know, but was a flat out lie, right?
Mhm.
I thought that I was telling them the truth, but it was a flat out lie. And I found that out afterwards. And, you know, just in one of the things that I went through, it was very kind of, I guess, early 2000 ballpark. They had a group from what we call the Illuminati who were contacting researchers in what is now the alternative community field. I don't like to name names and point people out because I don't feel that that's fair, but like, say, contacting a prominent author in this and whistleblowing information to him, right? Like telling him secrets. And as an example, the reason why most people understand that there's like a number of bloodlines and we have a group of names associated with that, that was put out deliberately, given to, you know, a confidant who passed it on to the researcher who went and wrote the book, and out it came, right? So even the book in question that you're talking about would have gone through a very similar, you know, filter than that, right? And that is all to, I say, they muddy the waters to make them appear deep. So a lot of it is to make like all those rituals and all those ceremonies and everything so grandiose that you don't think you could possibly use those tools for yourself, right? Also to kind of pervert your thinking about those tools to make you think that they're evil and dark and they couldn't possibly be used in any type of good way. And or on the other hand, to make you think it's all hocus pocus, it's not real, and you couldn't possibly do it. And then coupled with that agenda is now this rollout of technology that literally mimics everything that should be human ability, right? We should have taken these kids, studied them, learned from them, learned how to teach other people that, right? Which is what they did do. Like by the time I was even involved, they had like a system for nurturing these abilities, right? But then they would nurture those abilities to a point and then, try to take them away more or less, or try to make sure that the average person on the street never learned it, right? So that was part of why they compartmentalized us from the public as well, because we're always exchanging information with each other, even if it's not spoken, if we're in proximity to each other. So if you think about a kid like me or anyone else involved, like when I was in public school, anytime I was around another human, there was a potential for me to be leaking information to them on a telepathic level, right? So they even understood that and had methods in place to prevent me from doing that, as an example, right? So that's a lot of what the agenda has been, is just to make sure that you don't know, and everyone here listening doesn't know, that there's nothing special about any individual that you've heard of. We all have these abilities. It's human nature. It's needs to be nurtured, and we get the opposite of that. So that was kind of the job that I did. In a lot of those things, when it came to giving out the information, I was listening. Like I was involved because I was meant to listen to be able to do that job in the future. What I was being groomed for is more or less what we see rolling out now with the WEF, the World Economic Forum. This agenda that we see being pushed in schools and all this various spokespeople for it. I was basically meant to trumpet all of that stuff, but more specifically to this particular community that believes in things like aliens and all of that type of stuff, because they very much want it to get away from humans, right? And so they want all of that attention on ETs as much as they can, right? It's not a human ability, it's an ET ability, or it's a technological ability, right? Because then they can use that ET factor in ways that, has been predicted, like leaked information about them doing a potential false flag invasion, that type of thing, which obviously they're not going to do because that information got leaked, right? But they can still push those same buttons using that agenda. So combination of all of that, and hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. And you mentioned in the early 2000s, and I want to see if there's a specific change within the organization in the year 2001. Anything that you can think of in
Yeah,
terms of leadership?
the something big happened in the world in 2001. There was a big event, a ritual, as we, in this community would know it, right? And part of that ritual was what you would kind of refer to as a changing of the guard. That would have been, I use this picture to represent what I call the umbrella corporation. So I call what has kind of spawned from the ashes of the Illuminati is the umbrella corporation, which is why all the corporations are now running all of those other organizations we've always associated with the Illuminati, right? So right around 2001 was when they kind of, took that power forward. And 2001 specifically happens to be the year where all of those changes started into effect, right? If you think of like it being like a pebble dropped in a pond, that was the year. And that was why. And that lines up with about 400 and a 200-year marker kind of in the middle, of when the humans started to assume power from what people refer to as off-world entities.
According to the book, 334,000 Lies, the author, which supposedly was the former highest degree chair of the Illuminati, disappeared in 2001. Anything that you can think of in terms of the change of the leadership in the lodge or in the organization?
So that's what I'm saying, is there was a total turnover. Like it's not specifically that year. It was a period of time, like I'd say like 3.5, almost 4-year period of time that pretty much ended at about 2001. But that was when they, had enough of Like if you think of like a grandfathered in system, right? They had grandfathered out enough that they could start implementing all of their new policies, all of their new tactics, things like the Patriot Act and Homeland Security and things like that in the US specifically. Other countries had their kind of equivalents of the same. All of that again has led to what we're seeing today with the World Economic Forum and the one world government, and what we call woke ideology becoming a one world religion and things like that, right? So
Yeah. Also, you mentioned about the human ability and the power of the mind. Would you like to elaborate what you teach to the people in terms of your magic classes? Like what kind of things that you would encourage people to practice?
well, it's in three parts: imagination, will, and conviction. The imagination part is based on thought. It's based on our visual imagination, building that back, kind of understanding how powerful that is, which most magic teachings teach us, right? We understand that much. But then the will part also takes in line, a word you use, aura, what we call like auric energy, or the energy field that we have, right? I always refer people to the Heart Math Institute because they've done a good job of like scientifically quantifying all of that. But this energy field that we have, what it's made up of, what it does, how we can control and protect it, how that generates energy, how traditional magic works, right? Because you need energy to create anything, right? So how traditional magic works is a lot of those rituals you'll notice are like appeasing spirits or gods or some type of disembodied entity outside of the individual. And that's because there needs to be a kind of process when you're taking the energy from our field, transmuting it or alchemizing it into something else, what we would call magic, right? So we would use those deities as like a gatekeeper or a middleman, because if we do it on our own, there's a potential for a lot of volatility. We have a very powerful emotional spectrum, and all of that highly encodes our energy. So that's why they don't feel like we're responsible enough to do magic anymore, is because we don't know how to control our thoughts, feelings, and actions in that order properly, by their design, of course, but at the same time, that's the excuse. And so I teach people how to bypass that process as well. How, like, that energy that we're generating, that's our own. That's our divine gift or God source given gift, whatever you want to call that. And these other entities are basically just using us as like a energy source, right? They seem to be doing our will or their will or whatever, whoever's will, but only because that sustains them, right? It's like, I have to do this or I won't live, so I'll do it, right? And we don't need to use them to do that. We just don't. The reason why all of those systems are put in place is because they knew they were going to dumb us down the way that they do, and they intended to be able to control us the way that they have. And in the process of getting us to a place where they could, they needed to slow us down in such a way that we couldn't, right? So yeah, so I teach people basically how we have the ability to bypass all of that, the need for that external being, while explaining why, and then on the other end of it, this is where what we know as ritual a lot of the time, or ceremony, or words like that, there is physical action required to make it real. We need to, conviction is convincing your mind. And in order for a human mind to be convinced of something, something physical has to transpire that relates to the metaphysical or the energetic or the imagination on the other end. And so that's what the ritual is there for. So my course is meant to kind of give people the tools that they need to develop the relationships that they need in order to just do all of that on their own, right? Without me there holding their hand or some other guru or teacher. This is our natural ability. This is what we are meant to do. It is like riding a bike, that expression, like riding a bike to us, but we have so much information now that points us, leads us, ends us up in the wrong direction almost all the time. And that's by design, of course, too. But
I'm going to recommend you to my friends.
sure, absolutely.
Because you're the next level. And you also mentioned about the lollipop or
Yeah.
joy or something that is it true that the people who got it then are most likely going to die, or what's your like take on that?
No, if you think of it, well, the way that I've been kind of trying to describe it, it's a primer for a new type of technology. It's basically trying to prime us so that when that type of technology is used on a mass scale, like when we're using it for, things we used to take pills for, things we used to get IV drips for, and things like that, we're more compatible with it. It's part of that, moving us into non-human entities ourselves, or the way that I've described it is basically what transhumanism is a split in the evolutionary tree of humanity. Whereas, like, if you think of humanity as a tree, all of us who are remain natural through this process are on one side of the tree, and what they're trying to push is this entirely different version of human on the other side of the tree. It's been an agenda that's been rolling out for a long time. The lollipops aren't the be all and end all of it. So no, people aren't just going to die because they have it, right? Some people will, but like, it's the way I describe that is it's very similar to how, some people will reject an organ during an organ transplant, right? Or even the people who get like subdermal piercings, sometimes their bodies reject it, or even just an ear piercing, right? Some people's ears will just constantly get infected and never actually take the foreign object. And that's kind of what this is meant to do, is make it so that when they start doing things like implants, different types of medication based on that same technology, our body isn't as prone to fight it off, right? So, I mean, if you've read any of their doctrines, you understand that they're willing to kill a lot of people in order to in their mind, save some potential future, right? So like a certain amount of sacrifices is okay to them. So if a certain amount of people, don't, I'm trying to avoid words that might get this censored, don't take well to the new technology, and that ends up in a slight decrease of those particular people, then at least that particular genetic strand is kind of out of the code anyways, and the people in the future will be more likely to be very highly adapted to this technology. But the human body is very adaptive. There's not much that they can put into us that we can't train out of us. So I don't ever, subscribe to anyone who took that. You're doomed. You've got a time clock in you, right? But yeah.
I see. Yeah, because it's very consistent to what a whistleblower from China said about it. Very consistent. And this also I tend to think those people believe that I mean, some people believe that those who took the lollipop are going to die within a few years, or maybe 50% or so. I think the human body is more adaptable to that. Um, yeah, I think it's not a doomsday. It's just that it takes time for people to know and how to adapt the correctly, and to change their diet, maybe to do a lot of exercise, or maybe sunshine, and to really make their bodies immune system stronger, and to survive, even if they took a few lollipops.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you think of a lot of functions in the human body uh, are mimicked by nanotechnologies that we're starting to see, right? And so, we have lattices in our body that we call like genetic strings. And then there's these, if you were to look at it on a microscopic level, it almost looks like some type of creature that crawls across those at times, right? And so basically on like a nano level, that's all they've done is create that same type of lattice work for the nanobots to crawl around on. But that has to be, in the body, right? So what it is this type of self-replicating technology that basically creates that structure for these other technologies to latch onto. And that's why it will require multiple visits to the lollipop store for people to ever really be fully taken over by it. But because it's a kind of a progressive process, but that was a good way to get it started for them, right? I don't think that was specifically the plan, but I think they used it as a great opportunity to start this process, and it worked. So
Yeah. Within the organization, are there like degrees, like first degree, second degree, or third degree, or 41st?
so the Illuminati, as people understand it, kind of takes in all of those different organizations like Freemasons and Priory of Zion, anything like that. All of those organizations kind of have levels to them,
Mhm.
but you would probably have to progress through most of those levels to even get into what the public calls the Illuminati, right? So you would have gone through a degree system or something like that in most cases, but the actual Illuminati itself doesn't have that to it.
Mhm.
The structure in the blog, as I said, with the parents, the covens, and the families, right, is kind of how it works. And then, yeah.
Let's talk about the families. Like, I was told that there are 12 families in the world running everything behind the scenes. Not from this book, but from different book, Thiaoouba Prophecy. The author told me that they told him, and he didn't put that into the book. Are there like 12 families, or what's the number?
So if anyone ever tells you there's 12, they're one of those families because there's 13. But that's actually something that author is not the only one. I don't know that bit of book, but I've heard that in other places, and that's always been the joke. If anyone ever says 12, there's 13, and they are one. Right. So that's why that 13 is a superstitious number. The 13th floor does exist in a lot of buildings, but is never marked. Right. And there's usually not elevator access to it, but there's a lot of buildings all over the world that if you had a special key, that would take you to the 13th floor, unmarked 13th floor. Um, but yeah, that it's 13. Um, Over time they kind of spread it out. I can't remember, my memory for numbers is terrible, so I can't remember where it actually ended up. The numbers in the blog, I'm thinking it ended up being about 28, but there was 13 originals that started to marry into other families, right? Like I'm going to use something that's not true, but like a good example of how it could work. Like, let's say, Albert Einstein was never one of theirs, and he just became that brilliant man. And so they would have someone from one of those 13 bloodlines marry Einstein, as an example, or would, recruit him, marry him into one of those bloodlines. And then in a way, Einstein's family becomes a bloodline as well from there moving forward, right? So that's how it kind of expanded, but it started with the 13.
I see. You mentioned in your blog that at the top of the structure there's a entity called Draco, and you interacted with Draco numerous times in the past. Would you like to describe what Draco looks like, and is that like a male entity or female? Would you like to give more description?
I wouldn't like to, but I will. So the best visual description I've ever seen came from the Zack Snyder movie Justice League. If you look at Steppenwolf in that movie, that's what a lot of them look like. The thing with the Draco is they actually have tiers to their species as well. So they have what they would consider, for just to use human words, like a pure blood strain at the top that look like what I'm pointing to in that movie. And then below that, they have one that are a little bit genetically modified from them, look very similar, but have very, very white skin. Still very reptilian looking, but very, very white skin. Those ones you hear spoken about by a bunch of different whistleblowers, and it's in the lore of the whistleblower community of everything as the whites, right? Or the royal whites. And then below that, they have, 3 or 4 different subvariants of that typically do look like, what we would think of as a reptilian, right? Like a humanoid reptile looking thing. And they have some that are more like a brute type, which I usually would call like hunters or soldiers. And then they have a more mild form of that looks a little bit more humanoid, even, that they typically use as like scientists and researchers and people like that, geneticists. And then they have kind of their own common race, right? That is very reptilian looking, hard to describe because they're almost not quite, you know, humanoid in a way as well. But the thing with the Draco is they're geneticists by nature. They've created all sorts of variants of themselves, like hybrids, right? Like part of what they came to Earth for is always to like harvest genetics so that they can use those genetics in other places, mix them up in different ways, create different species. And yeah, they've done that a lot over time. We have a lot of words, even on planet Earth, that we refer to, or we think refer to, like an ET species or something like that are really just some type of genetic creation that the Draco had brought here at one point in time. So, Yeah, I think that's the best explanation I can give of it. It's very complicated because they're spread out kind of everywhere, but at that top, that's basically what they would look like. Is the Steppenwolf, Darkseid, and I forget the third character's name in Zack Snyder's version of Justice League.
And how did you communicate with them? Through telepathy or English, or what? What's the language?
Combination. When I was really young, they had like a technology that would translate for me. They don't speak English very often. Some of them would if they wanted to, but for the most part, they don't like us. They don't want to use our language. I eventually was taught a technique which is known as a cipher, which is a way of kind of telepathically translating language. Um, that they kind of give it to you like a software that you can install into your mind, and then when they're speaking whatever their language would be called, their Draco speak, I can understand it in my own language, in English. That's a kind of common technology. It's very similar to like Google Translate and how that works, right? So yeah.
Did you get a chance to touch them, or how was the interaction?
Um, it varied. I had a lot of interaction with them. So I mean, there was times where um, you know, I wasn't allowed anywhere near them or wouldn't want to be anywhere near them. I've developed personal relationship with individuals, right? And in that case, I'm not quite as worried to be near them or to have touched them, right? But I've touched them, had them touch me, but I don't know how to be too specific about that other than the answer is yes. It was kind
Because
of rare. Most humans have a really hard time being around them, and I never did. So that was why I was kind of the word utilized, to avoid the word used, to interact with them often.
the reason I'm asking is that there's another person called Ronald Bernard. I don't know if you know him or not. He is a Dutch banker who used to work for members of the Illuminati, kind of doing money laundering for them. And he personally witnessed a member killing a person, just use his mind. But he maintains that there's no reptilians, no Dracos. They're just human beings.
Well, and that's the thing, is like our lore in this alternative community has crossed all that in. And even though the Draco did exist there, it's almost ancient history. They've literally had nothing to do with this planet for at least 400 years now. One of the last things that they ever really helped humans with was creating the United States. It's pretty much they've been hands off since then. So, I mean, that's a long time. So most people living haven't had to have interactions with them. They had very few that kind of stayed behind and helped out, and would communicate with others. Most of my interaction with them had nothing to do with the Illuminati or anything like that. It was a personal thing that I developed with them over time. My interactions with them within what we would call the Illuminati structure was actually very limited, and like I said, it was rare, right? Like most people, I would say, I don't like to make too definitive statements because I know it offends people, but most people who have been in these programs, projects, and cults probably never saw one, right? They might have been given the illusion of seeing them to frighten them. They might have been told about them. They might have like kind of telepathically picked up on their visage from other people that they've been around, but to have actually interacted with them would have been very rare. The reason for that is simply they've been very uninvolved, right? There's certain technologies that the humans have reverse engineered based on theirs that they helped, you know, like before when I was talking about the grandfathering system, they had to grandfather all their technologies out as the human controllers, what I call the umbrella corporation, the leftover of the Illuminati, were taking over. Right. So there's been a bit of overlap. So I personally also say, even though, the Draco are there, they're not the kind of consequential figures here. Like, this planet isn't run by them, right? This planet isn't run by ETs. This planet isn't run by, it's humans who have a knowledge about those things and use that knowledge of those things to their own advantage, and has been for a very long time.
Got it. And in terms of who really runs this world, like if people are trying to track them down, are they able to, or to pinpoint like names or organizations?
I mean, at this point, it's really hard because like they don't even use that Illuminati bloodline structure at all anymore, right? So, and a lot of their main players are like kind of their poster boys as well. Like everything is out in the open now. That was one thing that they understood with the coming of the internet, was that they weren't going to be able to hide the same way that they used to. So, you know, it's kind of like, what's that expect? Oh, hiding in plain sight, right? Is that they do things right in front of our face now, and they do it with such frequency and so often that we don't notice it, or we focus on the wrong things, right? Like we'll get really hyper focused on, you know, some conspiracy theory about, you know, the Hollywood elites changing the changing the genetic makeup of their children so that they were, I'm trying to avoid words again, but I'm sure everyone listening can follow along, changing their children to be a different type of child, right? Not understanding that that's all part of a bigger agenda that has been happening gradually, where, like, you know, because of our use of plastics and the things in our environment, they've been changing our physical bodies over time. So what, you know, one side of a species looked like and was built like 100 years ago isn't true today because the genetics have actually changed. And yeah, all of this just kind of gets muddied up in our community and mixed up, and they know that as well. And so yeah, it's really, they're able to hide in plain sight. They're able to do things like put you know, President A, who is the most volatilely or just gross personality type and says all the wrong things, but at the same time tells you all the things that they do. Just sold all kinds of weapons to Sudan, great deal, you know, like things like that, like we're really rubbing our noses in it. And then that replace that with like literally an elderly man with dementia, you know what I mean? That's them rubbing their noses in it, doing it right in plain sight. Because what happens is, you know, people around our age and people who have been researching this stuff for a long time, even prior to the internet, we kind of have a pretty good structure or framework for what they've done, right? But now that they're doing all of that out in the open, young kids, young teenagers, young people are seeing it and being like, well, it can't be some conspiracy because they're doing, like, it's everywhere. It's, so what I've said is it's basically the replacing of conspiracy theories with incompetence theories, right? And that's been how they've been operating. And that's why, to answer the question, you know, to track down an individual or even a group of individuals at this point, we wouldn't be able to do, because it's literally like this whole swarm of humanity coming forward, right?
So let me ask you this way. If you were to give me like names of the people on the top, and I type the names on the internet, what would I find?
People who own television companies, education companies, universities, but don't really, you know, don't really get talked about in the news. A lot of the names that I would give you, you'd probably not find much about on Google, right? You might find that they're on the board of something somewhere down the line, but that's been a big part of what they do. They have, I call them like poster boys, or like a spokesperson, or like the front personality, to use their own you know, DID type terminology, arbitrarily, and I'm not pointing any fingers, but like an Elon Musk type character, right? And then they put him out in the public, and everything eventually will tie back to him, right? So it's a bunch of people behind the scenes kind of whispering in his ear, pushing him certain directions, getting him to make certain decisions, convincing him that things are right. And again, Elon, you're not going to listen to this, but I'm not talking about you. um, you know, then they do those things, and it's never the people behind the scenes, and it's always been that way. There's a researcher called Michael Tessarion who did a whole series on what he called the female Illuminati, pointing out that behind all of these names that we do know, there's always been this very kind of mysterious in the wings female in his ear, right? And that's how this system worked. And the Umbrella Corporation has used that 100%. Most of the people who are really, you know, making decisions, they do not have a role in the public. They just have the ear of all the people who do, right? They've even rubbed that system in our face when they told us about Jeffrey Epstein and the operations that Jeffrey Epstein was running. That's more or less how it works, right? Until you find out that name. Nobody knows that name. But meanwhile, he's been having dinners and all of this with all of these people who are making those decisions, right? But then when we look at it and everything gets exposed, it doesn't come back to all of those people. It just comes back to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, right? So that's that throwing people under the bus in order to bury what they did. Yeah, so even if I give you a specific name right now, there wouldn't be very far you could take it.
Mhm.
And I would get in too much trouble, so I wouldn't do it.
And are a lot of those real decision makers female? You just mentioned female Illuminati.
Yeah, traditionally they were. It's kind of something that people think about or forget about is that, you know, we had a long period of human history where women were in charge. And, you know, a lot of tyrants, a lot of very bad things started to happen, and men started to come, like, rise up, and then they took over. And what always happens, we're seeing it very clearly right now with like Republican and Democrat in the United States. When one pushes too far, the other pushes too far, right? It's almost like they're trying to find balance, but each side just keeps pushing too far. So you actually end up with a bigger sway than anything that resembles balance. And so that's pretty much what is going on there.
Got it. And another question is that what's going to happen in the future? Uh,
There's a lot of potential plans. It all leads kind of to the same place, which is, you know, kind of what we're already seeing it. This rollout of technology that removes us from nature, physically, our own internal nature, rewriting history, rewriting everyday reality in such a way that everyone kind of accepts that. Basically, you know, sucking the life out of real life so that a digital life, i.e., things like the metaverse and, you know, the theoretical concept of eventually ending up in a matrix type scenario, is where a lot of people are walking, right? And all of the events of the last 3 years have also set up the framework for that, right? And we're starting to see the effects. People don't want to work. They don't want to go back to work. Everyone's loving this rollout of free money, this rollout of free technology and everything that's associated with it. So that's all meant to, you know, foster in everything the community is already saying, the 15-minute cities, all of that type of control, very much like you're Chinese. So I'm sure you're aware of what they're doing in Wuhan now that everyone's, you know, distracted by the name of the place and not actually paying attention to what's going on there, right? But yeah, all those tactics are how it works. And it all leads to changing the human race into something that is no longer human, that is now this transient version of human. That's why trans is on top of all of our you know, our lingo these days, is because transhuman. It's where it ends up. And then being able to control everything through technology so that we never rediscover magic, and everything can just turn into that.
Is this their purpose, just to get control of the population? What's their mentality? Mentality is, don't they know that if they get control of everything, then if they reincarnate, and before they reincarnate, they're going to go through like a life review process, looking at how they did in their lifetimes, and if they did the wrongs to humanity, they're going to get consequences. Don't they know that?
You would think so. They also know that well enough to know that, like, our idea of, like, you know, you're going to go to hell or you're going to go to heaven based on what you did in that one lifetime isn't true, right? So the way we work off what we conceive as karma, it's not a form of punishment, and the judgment is actually directly related to us. The unfortunate reality is a lot of these people have convinced themselves that what they're doing is needed and right, right? They view us as, by our nature, even if we're shown the correct path, almost like teenagers rebel against parents, we're going to err off of that path, right? We're going to get ourselves in trouble just like most teenagers do, right? Like, that's the kind of analogy for it, is that parent to child, right? So once a child becomes a teenager, they are prone to rebellion simply because it's part of our nature. Every species on this planet seems to do that, right? And so there's a difference between guided and misguided rebellion. So if you're doing a rebellion based on a moral stance that you just won't take, like a hill that you're willing to die on, that's what you would consider maybe a righteous type of rebellion. And then that more kind of teenage rebellion, it's really just a rebellion for rebellion's sake, and there's no aim or directions to it, right? They're just like just taking some type of side path, and they don't really know what they're doing, right? And so what they believe, and to be honest, I still haven't seen them proven wrong, is that if people are just given the choice, they're going to take that path. They're not going to figure out that righteous path on the other side, because really the only reason they're rebelling is they want something else, but they've never really learned the something well enough to understand, you know, the baby in the bathwater, as they say, or the parts of the structure that are required, right? When you look at the type of people involved in what we call the Illuminati, they have very common traits, things like discipline and responsibility and order and routine, ritual, all of these things that they do. The average person who, you know, gets into spirituality, or, you know, the average teenager, when they're rebelling against their parents, they lose all of those things. They literally rebel against all of those things, and they take this path that, yes, is getting off of the path set out for them, which is obviously controlled, which is a good thing in and of itself, but they're doing it without a basis of critical thought and without a true moral stance, right? And so they're doing it, I'm trying to avoid a word to not offend some friends, but they're aimlessly wandering off the path, as opposed to deliberately taking and creating a new one, right? And they believe that if they don't do that for us, we're always going to go this way, and we're going to end up destroying ourselves, right? Just like a teenager who does, you know, run away from home and go off and try to live on the streets, they don't end up thriving, right? They end up spinning their tails. They may feel free, and they may be glad that they're away from their parents. They don't have to deal with that. They may have like-minded people around them living on the street with them and may be pretty content, but, you know, they're still stuck in a new place, which again benefits the people who created that original path, right? So that's what they're doing. They legitimately believe they need to direct us, because when we are left up to our own devices, we tend to take incorrect direction. And you know, again, they're not wrong in the basis of that, but, you know, to assume the right to be that parent is where they're wrong, right? So
in a sense, they're trying to illuminate us, and without the respect of individual liberty.
yes.
They're trying to guide us
Yeah.
without respecting individual freedom.
Well, it's the difference between, like, you know what's right for your kid, and you tell them how to behave. You don't really explain to them why they need to behave that way, right?
Mhm.
And if you did explain to the kid why he needed to behave that way, he could probably still behave that way in a way that isn't exactly the structure that the parent wanted, right? Like, being a good person is a choice that we make, right? And the more information we have of what it's like to be a bad person actually does push us towards making the right choice, right? Like, when we see what the negative outcome of a experience or a choice is, that's going to be our push to do the right thing, right? We don't want that, right? But that's what they've taken away from us, is the view of the proper view of our consequences when we do that. And so, yeah, it's it's such a dysfunctional thing, because they literally hold against us the consequences of their indoctrination, right? So it's really kind of, at this point, twisted. And now, again, I'm talking about where we're at now. You know, if you were to go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 3,000 years, 4,000 years, that starts to change, or maybe be even a little bit more true, that they felt like they needed to guide us and they needed to tell us exactly what to do. And I think somewhere along the line, they just realized how effective and fun that was for them. It's kind of like, you know, when people get power for the first time, there is something that gets stirred up in their ego, and they, you know, don't want to give it up. That's how I look at the umbrella corporation right now. And that's why I often say that it will probably balance itself out eventually, because, you know, the bottom line is technology can't control magic. And no matter how much they are trying, eventually we're going to rediscover, we're going to remember it's what we are, right? They're never going to be able to cut us off from that, because they can't really cut us off from our soul. And there's an energy exchange between our soul and our physical existence that's reminding us they're lying. They're lying, right? So eventually, you know, the pendulum's going to have to swing back the other way. But for now, what we're watching is them pushing it really hard in this way so that you forget what it means to be a human being.
Speaking of your magic classes again, will people learn how to be able to read auras, be able to levitate, be able to communicate via telepathy?
They would be able to use it for all of that stuff. Yeah, it's the way I describe it is I'm teaching it to you in safety mode, like on a computer, right? So you can download the program on a computer. You can try it out without damaging your hard drive or any of the files on your computer. It's like a training method. And then what I know is that if you start training these methods, you're going to find your own path to all of those things, right? And the reason why we tend to specialize in things is because, you know, every individual has things that they like better, right? Someone might like, you know, it's like that game we used to play in school of what superpower would you want if you could choose one, right? In a way, we all have one that we choose above the rest. And that tends to be the one that we gravitate towards unlocking the most, right? So in what I teach, it kind of opens that door for you to, you know, decide which of the multiple paths you want to go down. For people who've taken that class, I have what I call an expansion, which is two things. It's a group that we do like a group meeting once a month, and then everyone can share experiences and thoughts and stuff like that. I usually teach a little bit deeper of a lesson based on the tools I gave them in the original class from there. But it also gives people the opportunity to maybe work with me more one-on-one on a specific thing. Like if you're trying to learn how to astral travel, we can focus in on just how the tools that we used or these practices lead towards the ability to do that. While I'm running through it with people, I always describe like this is how you're practicing it, but this is where it leads to. And you know how fast you get there and if or when you get there is going to be determined by you, not by me. But this will, you know, help you get there.
Got it. Thank you for the information. And what do the parents think about you now?
Well, I mean, there's really only one left. So I mean, her and I have an understanding, always kind of have. I think in a way that maybe this is my ego talking, but I think in a way they might actually be happy because by the end of their own existence with all of this, they did see the error in it all, right? Like they did see how what they thought was right was wrong. And to be honest, that's what I got from most of them within my lifetime of knowing them was that none of them were happy. None of them felt like they were truly victorious in it all. And that's why they all took the out as soon as they had the opportunity. I think a lot of members within that structure that are still in it probably feel the same way, right? But you know, a lot of them they're going to die off before it matters. So it's this new generation that has kind of taken over. People that are, you know, kind of around my age, like in their maybe late 30s or 40s. That are coming out as spokespeople in the public right now, they actually do have a little bit more of a nuanced view of humanity than the traditional old school Illuminati does. There is a part of them that is a little bit more in line with us, but they also think that the transhuman version is better at the end of the day, right? So from their perspective, turning us into transhumans is the right thing to do, right? So it's not like they wake up every day again thinking they're doing this because ha ha ha, right? You know, the main people that we would be able to name that we see on, you know, the videos and the interviews and everything these days, they're kind of ignorant to it. So they actually do legitimately think that this is the correct path. They're going to discover that they're wrong eventually too. And that's, you know, when we think about karma and judgment, like I said, we kind of do it to ourselves. We also get it from our direct planet, in this case, Earth, right? And she just always has a bigger viewpoint than we do, right? So it always works out in the end, but you have to go through things. And it just so happens that Chinese proverb of "May you live in interesting times" is true for us. You know, we all do, and we're watching a massive change on this planet, and it's an evolution. Evolution is always messy, and
One fact that I'd like to see if you can corroborate. is that in the book 334,000 Slides, it talks about the reason for the author revealing the secrets of the lodge is that he found out that before 2001, there was a younger person who had more psychic powers than himself, but who had a evil-minded intention. The author, on the other hand, wanted everything to be more harmonious in the world, to have the lodge and the rest of the world more symbiosis relationship, like depending on each other, and also everything is about love and creating a more harmonious relationship. But this younger person who had more psychic powers was such like an antichrist figure that was trying to overtake him. That's the reason that he decided to make the secrets public, so that the organization can be broken from within. So this is what he says. Is there anything that you can make sense or corroborate?
I mean, such a thing doesn't exist, but having released something, we need there needs to be outs all the time, right? So for him personally, I'm hearing don't be mad at me, be mad at them, right? That kind of thing. And also to kind of have a manufactured reason for why it's coming out that isn't saying or isn't implying that he's trying to manipulate you, right? Or isn't admitting that there are aspects of it that he knows are not true. That's something I said that I'm not supposed to say, but I'm going to continue saying it, is that there were things that I ended up having to write into the blog that weren't true because I had to at the time in order to write the rest. And that's why I do my recast series now, is to try and correct those contradictions. But that's how they operate. So that would be his one part of that operation through his story, is to, have this story of like, oh, I have to get this information out because this, right? And yeah. And then the other part that happens, and happened with mine, is once they realize that you're doing it, they also want to try and get their own usage out of it too, right? So as an example, I have a written letter that's not written by me in my blog that is the example of that, something I had to agree to let happen, even though the way that I wrote it in the blog says that I asked for it to happen. That was something I had to agree to let happen because it was insisted, demanded, let's put it that way.
Let's talk about the holographic simulation. I agree with you that there are people who claim that they went into the secret space programs were actually under the influence or were a participant in the holographic simulation experience or experiment. When did that technology develop? Because if you look at some of the people, they claim that they had those in the 1980s. Did they have that technology in the 80s?
Before that, like, they were actually going to try to avoid names, but there's certain things that came out of World War II and the Nazi Party and the experimentations that they were doing. That was all the early stages of it, right? So it's literally been happening since. I know that the first thing that they ever built in Canada that is still here, that is part of that, was built in 1919. So it's literally been, like, say, the last 100 or so years so that they've been doing it. It's just the technology has continued to improve. The big boom started, I would say, at the end of the 40s. The programs, as we know them, started the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. The projects, the first main thing that they ever did was like the hippie movement. So when would that have been? The 60s into the 70s. And so the programs, kind of as we know them, with the holographic simulations and the testing of the secret space program and the super soldier programs and all of that, would have started probably the 70s into the 80s, and then ended the end of the 90s into the early 2000s.
How did it work? I mean, did they just have a machine and put a person in, or is it something like a person just is in bed and then there's some kind of Does a person need to be in a specific location?
Originally, yes. That's where like the testing and everything, they would actually have to have you in a specific uh, location. That's how all the testing was implemented. It's a combination of technology and drugs. So it's usually some type of an IV trip or an injection, and then some type of machine that typically looks like what you see in, like, say, Total Recall, that machine that they put him near, looks a lot like an MRI machine. Um, an MRI machine, we know it as a reading technology, but if it reads, it writes. So that means that if it can take images out, it can put images in, and it's always been true. Just higher versions of that technology exist in black ops programs that aren't available at hospitals, as an example. But yeah, so it was typically a combination of that. Eventually, it got to the place where they could do kind of a whole room at the time. So what that would look like is, say, a bunch of people hooked up to an IV drip that is a drug that's both keeping them sedated and making them more suggestible at the same time, while the whole room is getting broadcast with this frequency that is basically like a holographic overlay into your cerebral cortex, which makes you actually see the images that they're giving you. And it works along with your imagination and your subconscious so that it feels real because you're actually adding to it as it creates itself, right? So it's like a little bit of them hijacking your consciousness and giving AI access to that, so the AI can read it and show you what you expect or what you want to see, and that helps make it real for you. So again, I'm kind of talking about like layers. So older people, they would have experienced something like the MRI machine. Younger people, they might have experienced something like the room that I was talking about. And so where all of that has led to is now those broadcast frequencies that they started off in just a small room that would need to be localized. Early 2000s up till about 2012, they were practicing doing that with a town. And then from there, they could do it with a city. And now they can do it with this. They literally have this wrap over the entire planet that is called a broadcast frequency that, depending on, because it does work with what's already in your imagination, what you already is in your subconscious, what you already know, it basically just takes those images and those frameworks, those storylines, all of that, and mixes it up into a way that tells a story that always leads you away from your own personal truth. Right. And so that's what it's doing. And it's doing it to everybody. And depending on how, I don't know what the right word is, in tune you are, you interpret it differently. So if you're a person who is, into metaphysical stuff, maybe listened to a bunch of secret space program or alien abduction, I didn't mean space, alien abduction type material, and are sensitive enough that you would be able to know that you were picking up on that things, maybe say like you remember your dreams, then you're probably going to take that information and code it into something that works within the framework of what you already know. But if it was just like, the average Chad on the street, it could be something very different for him, right? Because what his imagination is feeding into the program is different. And therefore, to make it effective with him, the outcome also has to be different, or the story that he's being told has to be different. And so this can work on, an individual, like what we would call like a targeted individual. But even the targeting of individuals was, again, all experimentation and learning so that they could target all of us collectively, because they understand that, the morphogenic field and collective consciousness is very powerful. And therefore, if you actually do want to change the whole world, you start with individuals, but eventually you have to move into bigger and bigger demographics. And where we're at right now is they're just doing it to everybody. So all those programs, projects, and cults that I came up through, that's just civilization now. That's society. That's the way that they're running everything. And yeah, it's been interesting for me because, I got out after they taught me all of that, but before I ever started doing it for them, right? And then to see it all happening now, and like I won't say it, but I can literally point to the person in the world who's doing what would have been my job at this point, and seeing how it's all working, it's just undeniable. So the way it's not a joke. I mean it when I say it. I say it jokingly. Like I'm almost not mad. It's impressive that they've pulled this off, right? But yeah.
I mean, why did they choose like a secret space program scenario? why don't I just choose something like nicer without enslaving the participants in this simulated environment?
Stockholm syndrome. We like being victims. We start to identify with that really quickly. Savior programming. You're special, right? If you're being used, you're special, right? So combination of those two things in the cycle makes the person come back to it. And yeah, it's the same way therapy works. It's the same way narcissistic abuse works. It's a lot of different ways you can point at, you know, medication, like the pharma. That's how they kind of work, right? They give you the they give you the problem, and then they give you the pill for it, and then you become hooked on the pill, right? For it, that kind of thing. You know, that system is exactly how it works.
Have you met anyone who is open to the idea that there were participants in the holographic simulation experiment?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. There's been a lot of people since since it was kind of pulled out of me more publicly exactly what I mean by all of that. And it's been more people have kind of come to me through this community, but the intended audience of my blog, which is a phrase that I've used because I started writing that blog for people that I do know personally. It wasn't meant to be public. It changed once it was publicly discovered. I had to alter the path, and that audience grew, you know, massively. But those original people, they all knew, right? Like they're all well aware of the fact that they've never really done the things that they remember themselves doing, um, because a lot of them are, you know, had if you graduate through their systems, meaning if you're a good experimentee or like a good subject to experiment with, they do eventually let you in on the gag, right? Like they do, much like I remember, let you know that, hey, what you're about to do is a simulation. We're testing this. This is what we want to see happen, right? But if you never got to that point, you were drugged first, then woken up in a very drugged and like non-conscious state, you know what I mean, like not fully their state. Then you were front loaded, then you were running through the simulation, then you were sedated again, and then you were woke up and returned to where you were as if all of that time were just missing. And of course you're going to remember it because they can't just fully erase your memory. They can kind of mess it up so that you have a hard time retrieving it, things like that, but it's always going to be somewhere. Our subconscious fills in the blanks, right? So what we expect to see in certain situations is what gets filled into those blanks. And yeah, if you just, the people who were kind of honestly out there searching for this information, they weren't doing their own YouTube videos for the most part anyways. They weren't talking about this stuff. They were really just kind of listening in the distance, right? And so those are the type of people who have kind of been able to recognize it and kind of come forward and say, hey, thanks, because that's made things make a lot more sense, and I've been able to get back to living my life again. And then unfortunately, you know, we're seeing this in a lot of different ways. Like, we're tribal creatures, we're very prone to wrapping our identity up in things, right? And even sometimes when the foundation of your identity kind of gets disproven to you, you have a hard time letting it go. So yeah.
I mean, some people say that they had kind of confrontations with a school classmate, and then their parent kind of pinpointed him to to be enslaved in this special space program. And does that happen, or do they just pick a person that they disliked, or did they just pick a person that had psychic powers or maybe psychic abilities?
For the most part, it's people who are kind of uncontrolled demonstrating things, right? Because they don't like public demonstrations of telepathy or telekinesis or anything like that. They knew cell phones were coming, so they were trying to like make sure that that wasn't just happening, right? Back in the day, if like some girl in your town threw a chair across the room with her mind, you know, that kind of rumor or whatever that is gets lost really quickly, and you know what I mean, it doesn't go far, it's not consequential. But once we had cameras and someone could have filmed that happening, that would have become a problem. So knowing long in advance that day was coming, that's why they started doing that. So if let's say you were that little girl at your school who threw the chair across the classroom in the mine, and everyone in the school saw it, they would come in and they would gaslight the teacher and gaslight the other students in some way to convince them they didn't see what they did see, and they would remove that girl and they would bring her into one of the programs. So for the most part, that's where it starts. I am sure that some members have also used it to punish their enemies and the enemies of their children, and just people that they don't like. I mean, if you had that ability and that power, why wouldn't you, right? Of course, it just probably happened, but that's not really the rule. They're looking for people. That's why they put all those testing systems in schools too, because that, like Mensa programs and things like that, the gifted program through public, the elementary school level, that's all to find people that are exhibiting that and keep a monitor on people in case they do. Same with universities, kind of all works the same way, monitoring and recruiting.
Great. Thank you. I have asked all my questions, and do you have any questions for me?
Cool. I'm curious, this is a hard thing to talk about because of certain laws in the country in which you were born, but you grew up there, right? And
Yes.
you've taken in Western culture secondarily, right?
Yeah.
So, when you look at Western culture and you know what happened over there, is there a part of you that's just kind of laughing inside? Like, do people not understand where this all leads?
No, for the most part, the Chinese people from mainland China are very ignorant about everything that happens outside of China. So they're kind of strongly influenced by the media, which is controlled by the state. So they just focus on materialistic goals, and they just want to make a living, and they don't worry about the alien. For the most people, they just focus on making for themselves. There are a few people who are more spiritual and who want to find out what's really going on in the world, but they're limited by the information that they can access because the internet is blocked by the Chinese government.
Yeah, it's people are pointing it with part of what's going on with gender identities and stuff, and how it only seems to be happening in certain places, not other places, and there's all sorts of debate about why, but that's a good example how the places that don't have that constantly fed to them through their media and through their video games and through their movies and stuff never seem to really come to those conclusions, right? There must be something to that, in my opinion. So that's kind of what I was curious about.
I mean, even for the wealthy people, they spend time playing mahjong, they gamble in the casinos, and they take drugs and they drink and they do a lot of things that are not really helping their spiritual development. And this is a big issue. It's just like the end days of the Roman Empire. People were doing the things that are not helpful at all. And I think this is a main concern. And I'm trying my best to promote the more spiritual knowledge and the meaning of life.
Very good. Well, my friend, I think wrap this one up. It would be fun to do it again sometime if you ever wanted to.
I have another question to ask you without recording.
Okay. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, we'll do that once we hit the end here. But tell people where they can find you.
Yes, they can find me by searching my name on YouTube, Samuel Chong. I mostly talk about the book, Thiaoouba Prophecy, which tells about the story in which the author was taken by the ETs that have an advanced civilization, and also telling him the answers of the paranormal on Earth, such as who built the Great Pyramid of Egypt, what happens in the Bermuda Triangle, what's up with the statues on Easter Island, and reincarnation and the stories in the Bible. So that's a very unique book that actually led me into researching how to be able to see auras and interpret auras. That led to the book about the Illuminati, 334,000 slides. So everything is one goes after another, and I don't know what's going to take me to the next level, but I'm very glad to be able to talk to you. And people can just search my name on the internet. It's everywhere.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And that's a kind of beautiful story, right? To like, you know, you're continually searching, taking in more, letting that inform all of it, right? And that's what truth seeking is, right? Not just validating fun theories that we have.
Right, that's right. We need specific verifiable facts. We just don't need a lot of sci-fi stories.
True. All right, guys. Bye, everyone at home.
Bye-bye.